Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Malkin Fund, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America and Rudolph Finn. I'm Richard Heffner, your host on The Open Mind, and my guests today are friends and scholars who firmly believe that if we mortals can be taught to hate and then to die in violent conflict one with the other generation after generation, we can learn to live together too. That is the title of the incisive new study just published by Oxford University Press, Learning to Live Together, by medical doctors David A. Hamburg, President Emeritus of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and Beatrix A. Hamburg, immediate past president of the William T. Grant Foundation. The Hamburgs are now co-directors, social medicine and public policy at Cornell Medical College. Now they write that the centuries of history and millennia of prehistory indicate the profound and pervasive nature of human slaughter, that from small societies to vast nations, from one era to another, we see humans' inhumanity and cruelty to each other. And they add, indeed, the threat to human survival does not come from predators or dangerous forces of nature, but from other humans. Of course, we well know that we have the ability now not only to destroy all those we perceive as our most immediate enemies, but all of mankind as well. So what then, I would ask my friends Betty and David Hamburg, leads them even to dream that we will instead learn to live together? David, what leads you to this impossible dream?
First, we have a sense of urgency that we hope will be contagious, and we see signs, pockets here and there around the world of a similar sense of urgency. Why? The capacity to destroy is greater than ever. Just to take an example, leaving aside weapons of mass destruction, which you can't, but leaving them aside, the world is covered wall to wall with so-called small arms and light weapons, which means like all kinds of machine guns and mortars and so on. In effect, weapons of mass destruction too, but they haven't been even counted as on the list for proliferation. So that's one thing. We're covered wall to wall all over the world with terrifically damaging weapons in the hands of all kinds of irresponsible people, individuals, groups, and nation states. In addition to that, the capacity to incite to violence is greater than ever. We saw what simple hate radio did in Rwanda and former Yugoslavia. Everybody has radios now. There's no part of Africa so remote that there aren't plenty of radios to hear the hate messages if that's what comes out. And satellite television and the internet, which has lots of hate sites and lots of sites that tell you how to make weapons, so that the capacity to destroy is greater than ever, the capacity to incite violence is greater than ever, and you put those two things together, and we have to get that human intellect and ingenuity and dedication that got us to where we are through millennia of adversity, now focused at last on this problem. This is the century in which we've got to get a handle on the problem of war and genocide, or there's a very good chance that in the next century there won't be much, if any, humanity left.
But you know, Betty, I ask the two of you, what leads to what is obviously your optimism, and David paints a picture that is grimmer than ever before.
Well, he's explaining that as rational creatures, we will come to realize that we have to do it. But I'd like to look at it from another, perspective. I think that we all agree that there is a biological basis for aggression. Then that's established. But it's equally true that there's a biological basis for prosocial behavior and for learning to live together. And in fact, the world in which the behavior patterns were adaptive was a world in which, if we're thinking of hunter-gatherers, where our genome was being created, where they needed both. They needed both. There were outgroups of maybe some human species and outgroups of other species, other primates, other mammals, big cats, that kind of thing. So the aggression was needed and used. But human beings are relatively small, relatively weak, and the thing that really enabled the species, Homo sapiens, to become the most successful species on the planet was the ability to work together in groups and to pool their resources, to pool their intelligence from the big brains. And that, think back to the hunter-gatherer days, that was the real value. And so those genes, which are so important in those days, have been conserved. They have been selected, they've been conserved. And over time, the aggressive part of that has had much more a prominence other than within small groups, the family groups, small towns, within religious groups, fraternal groups, and that kind of thing. But those genes are there, and they're still being utilized, but disproportionately, they're underutilized. And so I've come to the conclusion that modern mankind is obsolete, and that the disproportionate emphasis in using the genetic potential, I think that we all know, evidence is clear, that biology is not destiny. What a gene gives you is a reaction range, and that's always been the case, and it's still the case.
But it seems to me that in a sense you're almost saying you find optimism in the notion that biology is destiny, only we have not understood what our biology
No, I'm
can
not saying
present
it's
us.
destiny. I'm saying it's not destiny,
No, I know.
it's potential. Well, there's a big difference. It is potential, and we have not utilized that potential.
And you're saying we can learn to live
And-
together.
and
We can use that.
Yeah,
balance.
We absolutely, if we didn't have that genetic potential, if it hadn't been so important in our early history when the genes were being selected and conserved, if it hadn't had the major importance that it had, we wouldn't have that recourse. But it's there, and it's prominent, and it is being utilized, underutilized, but utilized. And, David was talking about the media, the exhortations to violence, and the games on, the computer games, Mortal Kombat, etc. The media, again, is an unused potential.
For the other side, going about it the other way.
Absolutely. And I had the occasion to get in touch with the people at Annenberg School of Communications. And you recall that we actually met across this table once before when I had written a book on violence in the American schools. And the evidence, and in the course of writing that, the evidence of the media impact on the expression of violence was powerful. And then when I was thinking about it, I got in touch with the Hamburg people and I said, what about the studies for the impact of prosocial behavior? Well, there are thousands and thousands of studies on the impacts of the aggressive behavior, but there were less than a dozen for the prosocial. But one of the things that was interesting, and it still needs to be pursued, is that when studied in systematic ways, it looked as though the impact of the prosocial was more powerful than the impact of the aggressive.
But the prosocial, I think, and David's involvement with efforts to strengthen our institutions of cooperation, international cooperation, would indicate this. There doesn't seem to be a payoff there. There may be in your terms, in the terms that the two of you would pursue, but what is there in our society today, except, as you would say, ultimate survival, and it's a funny kind of exception, that would indicate that we're going to make use of these instruments for prosocial purposes?
I don't know whether we'll make use of it. I don't know whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. We are capable of it, but we may miss the chance. What Betty and I are fundamentally saying is that largely what got us here through the long course of evolution was our capacity to learn, particularly to learn in cohesive groups with a mutual aid ethic. That was very fundamental in adaptation. And those capacities can be turned to learning to live together instead of being focused so heavily on the in-group, out-group distinctions, which make invidious assumptions about the out-group and prepare us to hate or even to kill the out-group. We don't have to go that way. We can go the other way. I don't know if we will, but in terms of it is interesting, since the last time we talked about these larger institutions of cooperation, as you characterized them very well, there have been some very good things happening. There's a kind of a prevention movement that's been generating considerable steam in the past 5 years. And there are a number of concrete things happening in the European Union and the United Nations and a number of governments, particularly in Europe and in Canada, a number of important non-governmental organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars in Washington, a number of universities like Harvard, Stanford, and Columbia, and some in Europe. I'm saying that in governments, in non-governmental institutions, in intergovernmental institutions, institutions of potential cooperation, there's a great deal of concern. Part of the concern has to do with the killing that's going on right now in Iraq and Sudan and other places. But there are a lot of bright people thinking about this. There are positions being created, divisions within, say, the European Union and the UN being created that will, for the first time, have people thinking full-time. Do you realize until now, the UN has not a person anywhere in the world thinking full-time about prevention? Kofi Annan has just designated such a person to be appointed in the next few weeks. It's astonishing, but there's no reason why there can't be 1 or 100 or 1,000 in the UN, and so too in the European Union. And the European Union is emphasized because there's both a moral commitment growing in those countries and the intellectual capacity, the technical capacity, and plenty of money to implement prevention measures if they care to do so.
Well, let's talk about the European Union, though. For most of the prior century, we're now in a new century. Europe was the bloodiest continent in the face of the earth. There were wars going on all the time, and yet something has propelled them to form a European Union. I think that a while back, if anyone had said, I really think that people will move towards some ways of working together, some naysayers might have said, never, look at what's been happening. But they did move that way when the Cold War was going on. It was the negativity that it was mutually assured destruction but they worked together. They had hotlines. They had ways to prevent these bombs from accidentally going off, and they talked. There was a time when Eleanor Roosevelt talked about we have to address the whole issue of and adopt some codes for human rights, for respect, for empathy for other people, for working together as one species. And she was laughed at. Nobody thought that would happen. And so I think if you just look historically, I initially started by looking in an evolutionary perspective, but just moving now historically, we are making moves. We are making changes. We have the European Union, we have an African Union, we have the UN, and if you just take now current events on this timeline, George W. Bush had to move to working together. It was not his inclination initially, and he said so, that, you know, he was going to have a preemptive war and he was going to do it alone or with his own, you know, coalition. So I think that we are moving in this direction, and I don't believe, and we don't state in the book, that it's going to happen overnight.
No, you don't.
And I don't think it is. On the other hand, these curricula have been adopted very widely. Here, right in the city of New York, there is a program that's in about 120 schools on conflict resolution that has been adopted in Europe and all over.
Betty, when you, let's take an expression, no more killing fields.
Yeah, I've heard that.
You've heard that in David's book. What has moved Europe? And it's such an interesting point that you make, that you think of the greatest killing field of all for so long
was Europe.
And now we find something having changed.
Right.
What was it? Enlightenment?
I think that there's another way in which we learn, and there's a whole cognitive field, sciences, but I really think that one important way that we learn that's not in any of the descriptions of the cognitive scientists is learning by disaster. And I think that the Holocaust was so terrible, and it wasn't the first Holocaust. There had been, you know...
Hardly.
Yeah, right. But I think that the enormity of it, the images of it, the media, you know, all of these, that it was a learning by disaster. And I think that it was not only the Jews who said, never again. I think it was Europe who said, never again. And one interesting outgrowth, of course, quite specific to Germany, was that they began an education for tolerance, respect, and to raise a new generation and generations which would never do this again.
That was West Germany.
West Germany.
But I want to ask this question. I want to ask it of David. Do you feel that the people who have moved, the non-governmental agencies, the UN now, moving in the direction that you want them to move in terms of teaching us to survive, learning to live together, do you find that they are the same people who are doing these things that you would have expected, or that you have literally recruited other people, opened other eyes, that we are learning?
I think we are. I think there's a slow but significant recruitment into the company of those who are seeking ways to teach our children how to grow up on an axis of prosocial behavior. You see,
Recruitment? By whom and of whom?
well, people like us. I mean, we go around. We've been all over Europe and the United States, and universities and government ministries, foreign ministries, defense ministries, development ministries, various segments of the UN, prominent NGOs, non-governmental organizations. We're not the only ones, but there are a good many others. Betty mentioned here in New York this activity in the schools. Morton Deutsch, a professor at Columbia University, who's been a pioneer in theory and experiment on conflict resolution, and then with colleagues on the application of that in the New York schools, that has been a very important development. I hesitate to say there are a small number of us, or undoubtedly a larger number than I know, and indeed everywhere we go, people sort of react, as if to say, well, that's kind of been in the back of my mind, but I haven't got into focus. Now I begin to get into focus. What can I do? There is this sense that the situation is so dangerous and getting more so all the time that we really ought to bring our capacities to bear on it. And so we tried to sketch out from the existing research as far as we can what you could do if you want to go that route. If you want to go the route of prosocial behavior, of mutual accommodation, of social tolerance, how do you do that? And so we start with preschool children, and we do some things about elementary schools, some things about high schools, some things about colleges and universities and graduate schools. In addition, we throw in some things about religious education and education in community organizations and the use of the internet and the potential of the media. What we're saying in effect is that the situation is getting to be grave enough in the course of this century that we as human beings need to look at all the institutions that have a powerful shaping influence on what children and adolescents believe and feel about other groups. What shapes them to think badly or well of other groups? What shapes them to think they might find other groups interesting, compatible? How do they learn the skills of coming to terms with other groups? If you want to go that way, there are concrete things that can be done, many of which are supported by research to a certain extent, much less than we would wish, but in a few of the democracies, there's been a very serious effort to find out, yes, if you want to bring up prosocial children and adolescents, here are some paths that will lead you in that direction. And I think we're seeing at least some migration in the education community, the scientific community, and to a modest extent in the political community. Well, I shouldn't say that. I'd say in Europe and Japan and Canada, to a considerable extent in the political community, interest in this approach.
And they think of it in terms of conflict resolution.
Well, I also want to add at a more personal level, I think that a lot of the people that you've been talking about are policymakers and are people who mold opinions at a higher level. But coming back to the book I did, I think that when it began to be apparent to the American public that children were massacring their schoolmates,
Yeah.
and that it wasn't happening in the ghettos, it was happening in Springfield, Washington, where and it was happening in Columbine, that was viewed as a wonderful model community for affluent people. It was happening in Pearl, Mississippi, which was a very religious community. It was happening all over. It happened. I mean, and it's continuing to happen. And I think that's when the schools and the parents who make a lot of the decisions about what is and is going to be in their schools were demanding that we begin to do things. And you know what? I went around, I talked to a lot of the people, especially the young people. The young people were spontaneously getting together and saying, something has gone badly wrong in our school. What can we do about it? I'm going to sit down next to the people who look isolated and lonely, et cetera, and so that I believe that there was a grassroots, grounds up movement, as well as this more, top down, and that with this convergence, I think that it is really making a difference.
Has that happened in the schools of Europe as well?
Yes, it's happened surprisingly. After I wrote that book, I got calls from all over the world. I got as many calls from out of the U.S. as within. And
interesting, a lot from Japan.
And that was what I was just going to mention, very interestingly, because I said, oh, I'm surprised that you're interested in this, because I thought that the Japanese culture was to commit suicide, not to harm others. And he said, no, we have a very big problem. And a part of the suicides are the bullying and the aggressions that are being perpetrated on kids, but they also are harming other children. And so that the international interest, again, a man named Dan Olveus in Norway had a national movement to stop the bullying and the violence in the schools in Norway, and I think that it's this combination of it hitting home, quite personally, at the school level, and I think that the other thing is that the schools have learned that when you change the school environment, you change the classroom environment, that there's enhanced learning and that the academics improve as well.
But bear in mind, we're saying there's a basis for hope, but we're not assuming that it's actually going to happen. We're saying if you want to go in the direction of hope, we offer some guidance in this book.
That we can learn to live together.
Sure, we can.
And thank you both for joining me together on The Open Mind, Doctors Hamburg.
Thank you
for
having us.
It's a pleasure.
And thanks too to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time. And if you would like a transcript of today's program, please send $4 in check or money order to the Open Mind, P.O. Box 7977, FDR Station, New York, New York 10150. Meanwhile, as another old friend used to say, good night and good luck. For nearly a half-century now, our purpose here has been to provide the light of reasoned discourse rather than the heat of verbal battle. That surfaces clearly, and as they saw it, the new paperback collection of conversations from the Open Mind, with a foreword by Mario Cuomo and with memorable words from Martin Luther King, Jonas Salk, Betty Friedan, Malcolm X, Bill Moyers, Rudolph Giuliani, Norman Mailer, and dozens more. Read the book. I think you'll like it.